welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. With the winner of the U.S. presidency yet to be declared, former Vice President Joe Biden is edging closer toward the victory, while President Donald Trump says he will take legal actions contesting the outcomes in several battleground states. Today, we'll talk about the 2020 U.S. presidential race and about what we can expect from the likely president-elect in terms of his foreign policy, including those of the Korean Peninsula. Joining us is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Mr. Klingner was CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He is Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a few days since the November 3rd election. Even right at this moment, a handful of undecided states continue to count votes, and the sentiment could change any time. The race for the White House was indeed intense and competitive. How did you watch it so far, Mr. Klingner?
Well, I'd say with a bottle of 18-year-old single malt scotch in hand, I think a lot of people have been staying up a lot later than normal and drinking more heavily. It's been very tense. We've seen the votes get closer and get passed. So hopefully we'll have a resolution soon and that we can know who our next president or our re-elected president is.
And Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think the main takeaway that we've seen from this week is that this election is not going to bring a resolution, but rather it is going to be the change to a new chapter in a situation where the polarization in the United States is so deep that it also will have an impact on the leadership of the next president in one way or another in just about every dimension of policymaking.
Mm-hmm. Former Vice President Biden has signaled a possible overhaul of the U.S. foreign policies if he gets elected. Most recently, he vowed to rejoin the Paris climate deal on his first day in the office should he win the election. Shall we also expect a similar move in North Korean Asian policies, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that the debates showed us that one of the rare areas of agreement between the two candidates was about the objectives of policy in Northeast Asia toward North Korea and toward China, even though there are stark differences in terms of means for how to achieve those objectives. And so in that sense, I think that there will not be a big shift from a policy objective perspective, but how we go about trying to pursue those objectives could see some major changes.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, what is your view?
I agree with Scott, but I think there will be certainly a significant change in how the policy is pursued. We all want denuclearization. We can argue about whether we need more pressure, more diplomacy, or a mixture of that, as we've been debating that for decades. But Biden is going to end the bromance. He's going to have policy over personality. He's not going to claim victory before any progress has been made, as President Trump did. So we're going to see more of a bottom-up traditionalist view where the conditionality of summits is based on progress at working-level meetings before President Biden would agree to another meeting with Kim Jong-un.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we cannot exclude the possibility of President Trump getting reelected. If he stays in the White House, wouldn't his American first foreign policy also stay here, Mr. Klingner?
I think it'll continue, but we don't know really which policy towards North Korea he'd have. I don't think he'll go back to the fire and fury rhetoric of 2017 unless North Korea does a nuclear and ICBM test, and then we'll have to see how the president reacts. We really don't know. I think he'll largely ignore North Korea, just continue to claim that there's been success there. And he'll depict it as having prevented a war on the peninsula, though there was no concern of war in 2016 before the administration came in. And he'll just say as long as they're not doing a nuclear test or an ICBM test, then that's success, regardless of all the other missile violations that have occurred.
Mm-hmm. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who would have been hoping for Trump's re-election, must be going through some preparation for Biden's possible presidency. What will Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime be thinking right now, Mr. Snyder?
Well, my own view is that the North Koreans have been hedging against uncertainty about who would win the election from the beginning of this year, and that they've been trying to position themselves as an entrenched nuclear state. And so the objective, regardless of who wins for North Korea, is to try to lure the new administration into détente, not denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Klingner, your thoughts on this?
Right. Well, North Korea really has two plays in the playbook. They have provocations, threats, attacks, and then charm offensives, which tend to be more offensive than charming. And really the change that's occurred over the years is how extreme they go with either of those. So in 2018, we had a pretty extreme charm offensive, all the summit meetings with China, South Korea, the U.S. If Biden is elected, I expect that there will be a provocation of some severity, because North Korea always does something very strong the first year of a new South Korean or U.S. president's term. In the words of a North Korean defector, to train them like a dog. So I think they'll do something provocative in 2021, and that way it'll test Biden. My concern is if President Trump is reelected, he may go for a premature peace declaration or a minimalist denuclearization accord to try to get a Nobel Peace Prize. And a quick agreement is a bad agreement.
Mm-hmm. You just said North Korea is likely to turn to provocations if Biden becomes the next president. But is there a possibility that North Korea will offer an olive branch to the new U.S. administration, Mr. Klingner?
They could. But, traditionally they've done something provocative in that first year. Remember back in the first few months of the Obama administration when Obama had been blaming the stalemate on negotiations all on George Bush. And yet while he was still doing his policy review before he could reach out to North Korea, Pyongyang did a nuclear test and an ICBM test, which led the Obama administration to adopt a firmer policy than they had been planning. And we saw the same during the first year of the re-election of Obama, and then certainly in 2017 when Trump was in with all the nuclear missile tests. So I would expect a provocation, but then North Korea would also offer an olive branch to ratchet down the tensions which they raised.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, what is your view on this?
Well, I agree with Bruce about what North Korea's conventional playbook looks like, but I would argue that there are two wild cards that could potentially lead to a different approach by North Korea. One is Kim Jong-un and whether he's going to follow exactly the path that his father followed. And the second one is that actually by pursuing provocation, I think the North Koreans really need to think about what that signals, because provocations signal weakness and they signal the idea that time is not on your side. So I think actually the approach that North Korea should take that would comport with its objectives more clearly would actually be a policy that showed a little bit of self-confidence and that could afford to wait to engage the new president until the new president is ready to engage.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, South Korea's President Moon Jae-in received a briefing from his National Security Council team. And after this briefing, the presidential office in Seoul said, regardless of the outcome of the U.S. presidential election, the U.S.-South Korea alliance will remain robust. It also said South Korea will continue to cooperate with the U.S. for the denuclearization of North Korea and peace regime of the Korean Peninsula. What do they mean by this, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think that what the Moon administration is saying is that the alliance is critical to South Korea's national security interest, regardless of who wins the election. And that actually, to some degree, Moon has no choice but to work closely with whoever wins the election, regardless of his preference. And so, in that sense, I think the really interesting thing to watch for, especially in the context of a transition, but even if Trump continues, is what is the personal chemistry between Moon and Trump, or more importantly, perhaps, between Moon and Biden. And I would actually argue in the Trump era, the Trump-Kim relationship has been the most important relationship related to the peninsula. In a Biden era, the Moon-Biden relationship may actually be the critical relationship.
Mr. Klingner, your take on this?
Well, South Korea, like all other countries, have to hedge their bets. They will have to deal with whichever president is in office. For South Korea, there will be a plus and a minus to having Biden if he's elected. The plus would be Biden would return to a traditionalist American view of alliances based on shared values, principles, objectives, rather than a transactional relationship seeking to make a profit off of U.S. forces stationed overseas. So Biden would likely abandon the exorbitant demands for large increases in burden sharing negotiations. He would likely drop, or as he even said, he's going to drop the threats of reducing U.S. forces. And Biden won't engage in the insulting rhetoric that the Trump administration has. So that'll be a positive. But on the negative, Biden is less likely to do an impetuous meeting with Kim Jong-un and sign a peace declaration, which is one of Moon's main objectives. So there will be less tension in the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Washington, but perhaps a less potential for progress or seeming progress between North Korea and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Does this mean that we should expect some changes or at least some adjustments to how the U.S. and South Korea work together on the North Korean issues, Mr. Klingner?
Well, I think it will be easier in that there won't be the underlying tensions from the alliance issues of OPCON transition, special measures agreement negotiations. But there are going to continue to be, I think, large gaps between how the U.S. and South Korea approach North Korea. The U.S. is going to be focused on sanctions, although sort of weakly implemented, and maintaining, the sanctions and the pressure while reaching out with diplomacy. Whereas South Korea really wants to reduce the sanctions, reduce the pressure, and offer concessions to the degree possible under sanctions towards North Korea to try to get them back to the table.
Mr. Snyder, what do you expect?
Well, I see a more challenging pathway for the alliance under a Biden administration in terms of coordinating with Moon in a number of areas. And one of them is related to the relationship between peace and deterrence, because I think that the Moon administration really wants to focus on peace. I think the Biden administration is likely to restore an emphasis on the credibility of extended deterrence. And so I think that'll be a challenge. A second area that will be focused on is coordination of policy towards China. The Biden administration, I think, would be likely to focus in on building an alliance-based network that will confront China in a number of areas on the rules-based order. And it's not clear to me that Biden and Moon would be on the same page on that. And then finally, I think that the Biden administration wants to reinvigorate alliances, including trilateral coordination with Japan. And we all know that there are problems in the South Korea-Japan relationship. And so these are issues that I think are going to be more challenging than people might realize. Frankly, because Trump is out of the picture, the spotlight is going to be on these cracks in the alliance, and the onus, I think, is going to be on the Moon administration to try to cover over some of those cracks.
And South Korea has played a mediating role between the U.S. and North Korea, especially in realizing the historical summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. The South Korean government also has been pushing for the end of the war declaration of the Korean War. Will South Korea continue pursuing these with the incoming U.S. administration, Mr. Snyder?
Well, he probably will, but I would argue that in order for those policies to be successful, Moon needs cooperation from Kim Jong-un. And so the focus in terms of building support for an end-of-war declaration or for peace on the Korean Peninsula really has to be on bringing North Korea on board. And I see precious few signs that North Korea is ready or willing to join that effort.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mr. Klingner?
Right. President Moon really is pursuing a peace declaration as some way of trying to induce movement in the Washington-North Korean relationship. But the U.S. is less interested in that. They question what's the utility of this document. Moon hasn't defined what it would be. If it's just simply a one-page paper that the war is over with 2 or 4 signatures on it, how does that affect North Korea's behavior? How does it reduce the North Korean military threat, including conventional forces? It doesn't. But also North Korea, as Scott pointed out, hasn't been interested in negotiations or dialogue even with South Korea or the United States. And last year they even said that a peace declaration is unimportant. So we really don't know what North Korea is thinking. When U.S. negotiators met with them in Stockholm a year ago, they tried to get North Korea to define, what do you mean by a peace declaration? What do you mean by hostile policy? What do you mean by a security guarantee? And the negotiators wouldn't give any definition of what would enable progress.
Mm-hmm. And during the Obama administration, the sanctions on North Korea were considered to be weaker compared to the Trump administration. Which path will the Biden administration take on sanctions, Mr. Snyder?
Well, I actually disagree with that characterization to some degree, because I think that the last year of the Obama administration actually was the time when the platform was built for application of maximum pressure, and it was backed by some legislative actions that were taken at that time. But the real question is, how do you reconstitute sanctions pressure? And I do think that a Biden administration will want to use sanctions pressure. They need to find a way to use it more effectively than it's currently being used, and that probably means there does need to be some kind of revamp of the sanctions regime.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Klingner, what are your thoughts on sanctions?
Well, successive administrations of both political parties have underperformed on enforcing U.S. laws. The Obama administration had what I call timid incrementalism of, even though they had a long list of entities they could have sanctioned, they'd sanction 2 or 3 at a time, hoping that would cause some change in North Korean behavior, and then they'd wait for the next provocation to do 2 or 3 more. The Trump administration's maximum pressure has never been maximum, and President Trump, right before Singapore, said he didn't even want to use that term anymore because we're talking so nicely to Pyongyang. He announced 300 North Korean entities he wasn't sanctioning. That's 300 entities violating U.S. law on U.S. soil in the U.S. financial system. And he reversed Treasury Department's actions against 2 Chinese shipping firms. So we've never been at maximum pressure, even though it's a nice bumper sticker. So I think Biden will use sanctions and pressure as one of the instruments of national power, but there's a question of how strongly he'll use it.
And my last question, while Biden has criticized the Trump administration's foreign policies, couldn't the new administration try to succeed some of the incumbent policies that turned out to be rather effective? Which North Korean policies could the next administration adopt from the incumbent administration, Mr. Klingner?
Well, I think the tools are there. Diplomacy, deterrence, information, pressure, etc. It's really just how differently you use them. I mean, 2 carpenters will use the same tools to build 2 totally different houses. But there's a lot of commonality in those policies. But the other end of the spectrum is, what will North Korea do? We've had 8 international agreements with North Korea. All have failed. North Korea has really indicated it has no intention of denuclearizing. So, regardless of who the president is and regardless of what tools they try to use and what combination, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. So I don't think there's a lot of optimism that any president can bring about that, at least without a lot of pressure, a lot of energetic diplomacy. But the ball really is in Pyongyang's court.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, your last thought?
Well, I think that the second presidential debate actually gave a demonstration and a clue to how a Biden administration has adjusted its approach based on the success of symmetry in terms of engaging with Kim Jong-un. On the one hand, Vice President Biden criticized Trump for legitimizing Kim Jong-un and called him a thug, but then he turned around and said he'd be willing to meet if North Korea came back onto a denuclearization pathway. And so essentially what Biden is talking about is conditional legitimation of Kim Jong-un as a ruler. And I do think that represents an adaptation of an innovation that occurred under the Trump administration.
The presidential race is still too close to call, and the vote counting has been slower than many would have expected. With all the eyes on the key battleground states, we'll have to remain calm and patient until the final results come out. Mr. Klingner and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.